So tonight, I am going to attempt to explain what led up to the events of October 19, 1983, and subsequently the invasion or intervention of October 25th, 1983. But to understand those events on October 19, 1983, but to understand this, you have to understand how army functions, okay? So you have to understand ranks, gradation of armies, and leadership. So I'm going to explain these factors separately. But I also want you to understand the genesis of the PRG, how it came into being. And I believe the best way to explain this is to explain it in terms of parties or groups. So you had a group called RL, okay? And you had a group called MAP. And together, RL and MAP formed an alliance with Jewel, which is another group. Now, some will say that RL and MAP hijacked Jewel, and that caused a lot of problems with the original Jewel members. So they sort of dissociated themselves into what will morph into a new Jewel movement, a new party, okay? And in some respects, some will also say that the original Jewel members was sidelined and the party was overrun by RL and MAP members, okay? So now you have the new Jewel movement. That's a new party. So that is a party that would move on to overtake Gary's administration and then become the PRG government. Now, I want you to understand the character of the people who are RL and the character of the people who are MAP. Now, MAP was more Maurice Bishop, Unison White Men, and these type of guys. They were more political guys. So allegedly, RL was more Bernard and his crew. So a lot of the guys in RL would have had military experience, basic military experience, because a lot of them would have been part of the Cadet Corps. So it was a natural consequence that when the NJM took over Gary's administration and became the PRG, that these guys would have gravitated towards officer cadre and officer candidate role in the army, right? Whereas Maurice Bishop and Unison White Men and those guys would have gravitated to more political roles in the PRG, right? That is critical to understand. So what you have is the Aura guys are the main leadership. They form the leadership of the army, all right? And MAP guys were more political as Maurice and Unison White Men and so forth, okay? So that is important. Now let's explain a little bit about ranks, gradation, and leadership in armies. So of course you have the guys at the really lower tier, okay? You're talking about enlisted guys. You're talking about the privates, okay? Who form the bulk of the army, all right? And then above the privates, you have the corporals, right? And above the corporals, you have the sergeants. And above the sergeants, you have the lieutenants. And above the lieutenants, you have the captains. And above the captains, you have the majors. And above the majors, you have the lieutenant colonel. So generally, more developed armies, you have different sergeants taking care of different things. You have different lieutenants. You have first and second lieutenant taking care of certain things. You have generally the company. You have the captain who is the commander of the company. All right. The company commander is usually the captain. So at the battalion level now, you have the lieutenant colonel. He is actually the combat commander at the battalion level. So, but you have to understand in armies, you have people who assist you as the actual combat commander. Okay, because you don't want to be doing a lot of paperwork and all these things while you should be focusing on tactical things. All right, so you have a bunch of staff guys, okay, who help you out with, giving you information so you can make tactical decisions. All right, that is why at the battalion level now, you have the major, who's like a staff officer who assists, okay, the battalion commander and helping him and giving a lot of information so that he or she can make combat decisions. All right. That is critical to understand. It is the same thing. Okay. At the platoon level. Okay. You have sergeants assisting the platoon commander, which is usually the lieutenant. Now, if you go back down a little at the squad level, there is a bunch of sergeants assisting with leadership at the squad level. A sergeant is in charge at the squad level, but there's a bunch of sergeants helping out. So that's just to give you a little insight about the gradation of armies, right? So I want you to understand the political structure of the PRG government, so you may understand political decision making. We have a central committee that is responsible for making major decisions. And in that central committee, there is what you call democratic centralism. Democracy prevails. Okay, I want you to understand that. Remember that, democratic centralism. Democracy prevails. One man, one vote in the central committee. So if a decision is made, okay, it's made by the majority of votes in the central committee. So towards what would become the end of the revolution, there was an economic crisis. Remember that, there was an economic crisis. And as you would imagine, economic crises test any institution. It can add pressure and stress to the institution. And that is exactly what happened. Because what started to happen is that towards the end, what would become the end of the revolution, they were not receiving as much external aid as they used to receive. So that created a problem. Things were economically tight. So when they experienced those problems, their reason that the issue was that they were not implementing Marxism effectively or properly. And that is why they were having problems. And then another aspect of it is that they started to blame each other for the problems. Okay? Some actually blamed and attacked the leadership style of Maurice himself and felt like he was not doing enough work, all right, to get the masses in line and help them to understand the whole Marxist doctrine and where they were heading. So they started to blame him. A faction within the CC started to blame him. It's like your fault. So they were back and forth blaming each other. So part of their solution was to actually merge the strengths of Maurice Bishop and merge the strengths of Bernard. That was their solution. They figured that would be the solution to the problem. So, and in their eyes, they saw Bernard as the one with the intellectual capacity, okay, and intellectual ability and understanding of Marxism. So they figured if they merged the strengths of Maurice and Bernard, Maurice was great with the people, he was charismatic, and Bernard now had some sort of intellectual clarity, as they believe, in terms of Marxist-Leninist doctrine. So if they merge these two characters in a sort of joint leadership, then guess what? Everything would be fine. They would solve the problems that they're facing. So they went to the CC, the governing body, and they had a vote. They made a decision, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to merge the leadership. We're going to have joint leadership, okay, within the party. So they went to the CC and they voted on that issue. And they agreed. So they agreed there was going to be joint leadership. There's a vote. Obviously, in that vote, Maurice's faction did not win. If they had a chance, they probably would not have voted for joint leadership. But they did not have the numbers. They did not have the majority of numbers in the CC. You have to understand, remember what we said, just go back a little to RL and MAP. So you have to understand, in the CC, there was representation from the officer cadres. Mars didn't have much representation from the officer cadres. Most of these guys originally would have belonged to the RL faction. So obviously, when it comes to a crisis, they might have voted for their guy, which was, of course, Bernard. So everyone talks now about that trip Maurice made just before the events of October 19th. Okay? But remember, everything is kind of tense. Everything is really tense. You know what I'm saying? So even though he may have agreed about joint leadership before that trip, when he made that trip, I guess they always say, the plane is clear from the mountaintop. If you're on top of the mountain, you're looking down on the plane, you know what I'm saying? Then guess what? You get different perspective. So he might have made that trip, got a little different perspective. And some may also say he might have been influenced because he made supposedly an unscheduled stop in Cuba. Okay? So there's no telling what sort of conversation was had. And somebody might have said, or people might have said, Are you sure this is going to work? How is this going to work? All right. And he had gone to the US. So, nobody knows what transpired in terms of his perspective on what was going on back in Grenada. So, however, when he came back, his mind totally changed about this whole leadership thing, this whole joint leadership thing. Because he's probably thinking in his head, how is this going to work? He might have had people whisper in his ears when he went abroad. So when he came back, he was a totally different person. But there was some sort of sourness taking place. There was something brewing. There was some sort of friction. There was some sort of friction because when he came back, it is reported that the usual welcoming committee and people who were supposed to be there to receive him was not there. So that was like something ain't right. So there was a lot of suspicion among these guys now. And then he started saying, no, you know what? I don't think I'm really down with the joint leadership stuff anymore. You know what I'm saying? Let me, think about it a bit. I'm not sure how it's going to work, how we're going to explain it to the masses and stuff like that. So that sort of like put a sour taste in the other guys. And I say, oh, we agreed on this. Okay. It's democratic centralism. It's democracy in the CC. The CC agreed on this. So we have to go according to the CC. You understand what I'm saying? The Central Committee agreed, you agreed, and this is the decision. You can't renege on that decision. Not anymore. Because that is the system in place. So a lot of people, the regular Grenadian person, would not have understood what political system that these guys had. Nobody understood the CC thing. They really did not understand what system was in place at the upper echelon. There's also talk now, Maurice is probably getting paranoid for good reasons. And they're also getting paranoid because there's some sort of, lines are starting to be drawn. You know what I'm saying? Even threats are going back and forth. Okay? Threats are going back and forth. It's even alleged that one of Maurice's very personal bodyguard, okay, who, people talk about their relationship as being like father and son. You see what I'm saying? So it's alleged that that gentleman, who probably was not in Grenada at the time, actually sent a message or called and said, look, I heard that you guys are trying to F with the boss. And we're not having that. If anything happens to him, blood will flow. These were some of the statements. This is serious statements. And you have to understand that you're dealing with an army here. You're dealing with men who are heavily militarized, okay, and heavily armed. So with all this suspicion and all this paranoia existing, apparently it is alleged that Maurice would have told another of his bodyguard that, look, I believe that these people are plotting against me. And I want you to very secretly let the mass of people know, let the Grenadian people know that these people are plotting against me. Okay? But apparently this gentleman, one of his bodyguard, was actually allied with the RL faction within the NGM. And he might have decided, look, I'm going to tell my friends. And obviously he spilled the beans. So what happened after that is that there was a meeting called. And this gentleman in the meeting actually said, yes, Maurice did tell me to do so and so. All right. So Maurice denied, no, I didn't do anything like that. But this guy said in the meeting that, look, yes, you did. So he sort of embarrassed him. You see what I'm saying? And then now was some sort of order to put Maurice under house arrest because this is causing problem. And if this gets out to the masses, this could cause a lot of problem, major problem. This could disrupt the whole flow of government because they understood the power of the masses, how much the Grenadian people themselves loved Maurice Bishop. Again, he was a charismatic leader. So that happened. So when no progress is being made and people are not hearing now from Maurice Bishop, people are wondering what the hell is going on. But of course, his political friends, his MAP friends from back in the days, decide, well, no. This is getting out of control. We have to let the masses know what happened. Okay? So they decided now to start, getting that information out there. Letting people know what's going on. That, he's actually under house arrest. That's why you're not hearing from him. They decided now to mobilize the mass of people and actually have a protest and demonstration and go to where he's held under house arrest and free him, you know, because these people are passionate about their leader. They said, you know, look, we're going to free him. We're heading to where he's at because we want our leader. Where is our leader? We're not hearing from him. And that is where you would hear people talk about the protest and the march up to Mount Weldale, which was the Prime Minister's residence at the time. Now you may hear about all the things that happened at Mount Weldale. Okay? You may hear how there was initial firing of shots in the air. There was initial back and forth between the soldiers that were guarding the place. Okay? And the masses. And they were just, you know, they overwhelmed the soldiers pretty much. Okay? And then the soldiers sort of retreated. And then they went into the property, took Maurice Bishop, and got him out of there. Now, the initial plan, based on what is said, is they had planned to go to the market square so Maurice could address the people that were waiting for him in the market square. Tons and tons and tons of people, okay, was waiting for him in the market square. But for some reason, I'm not sure whose advice it was, they decided to head towards Fort Rupert, okay? So while all the masses are waiting down in Market Square to hear from Maurice, a portion of the people went towards Fort Rupert. And there is some talk that the possibility or the reason for going to Fort Rupert was so that Maurice could communicate to the outside world. Apparently, they might have some communication capability at Fort Rupert to get out to the outside world. And so that might have been the reason for heading towards Fort Rupert. That is what is alleged. I'm not sure. Again, when they got to Fort Rupert, there was some sort of back and forth, okay, and confrontation with the sentries that were guarding, okay? And then again, they were overwhelmed. It is alleged that a certain lieutenant from town who has since passed, okay, pretty much smacked one of the sentries and said, "Leonard, this is the commander-in-chief. You know, you got to let him on the fort." Because, of course, you know, it's the sort of thing civilians should not be on a military installation, so that's understandable. And that's one of the justifications of the things you would hear from the military guys, that what the hell is civilians doing on a military installation? That, you know, that's a no-no. All right? So that was one of the things. But anyway, the people again, the masses again, overwhelmed the sentries that was posted there, and they headed up to the fort. So there was also again some communication from Fort Rupert to Region 1 or Fort Frederick, where the other faction would have retreated to. They went to Fort Frederick, all right, Region 1. So they're all up there. So apparently there was some sort of communication from Fort Rupert, right, to the guys at Fort Frederick. And it's alleged, I believe it was Unison White men that would have said, okay, to the guys at Fort Frederick that, look, we want you guys to surrender, okay, or surrender to the nearest police station or whatever. And there might have been some talk of, we want manners for you guys. Now, under the political environment that existed during the PRG, if someone says that to you, if someone says we want manners for you, you know what that means. You understand? So I think there was a miscalculation in the thought, right? And they probably would not have calculated that, hey, the people that you're talking to, okay, at that moment have more military means at their disposal to deal with you. And you are just leadership in that moment in just name. And you do not have the military might or the military resources to back up your leadership. So it was a fatal miscalculation in that sense. They did not estimate where the actual military power lied, because these guys have access, okay, to all the military means at their disposal. Now you have to understand, let's get back to army ranks. So at the battalion level, okay, at the battalion level, you have the lieutenant colonel. He is the combat commander, okay? So apparently, with all this back and forth, and it's seeming now like a line is drawn, you know what I'm saying? Threats were made. So this is not games anymore. And you have to remember now, the oral guys are all at major upper echelon ranks within the army. And they have access and command, still command, of all this military equipment and hardware. Okay? So it's a fatal mistake that was made. Fatal mistake. A total miscalculation. You understand what I'm saying? So it's not like there was a bunch of, weapons at Fort Rupert that could have offered any resistance or command those guys who had access to much more military weapons and hardware at their disposal and still are in command. You see what I'm saying? And command is a big thing in the army. Nobody, you don't mess with command. So you have the lieutenant colonel at Region 1, at Fort Frederick, and then a decision is made. Nobody knows who made the decision, but the gentleman, I believe that the lieutenant colonel said it was his decision. Okay? But all these guys are up there. I don't know what was discussed, and I don't know who would have been in charge of that whole clique that would have been at Region 1 at Fort Frederick. Okay? But whatever was discussed, and as I said, it's alleged, and I think I might have heard the lieutenant colonel say he made the decision that he wanted to send the military to clear the fort and get the civilians off the fort and restore some sort of order. And hopefully then they probably could talk about how this is settled. So that, their claim, was the initial intent. Okay? That was the initial intent. But you have to understand, I want you to understand something. In all of this, okay, there is unseen forces that are monitoring stuff and reporting stuff. Remember, the army itself has an infrastructure that's already there, that exists. And the command has not changed. The command is still in charge. So they have access to information, and they have eyes, unseen eyes, all over the place. Because you have to understand something. These people had an intelligence network. So people probably could have been communicating back and forth and telling them what is going on at Fort Rupert. Okay? And then Maurice and his clique and these people, they would not have been aware of what's going on. That these people might have been communicating to the guys at Fort Frederick or Region 1. But that is just natural to assume that here you have an army, you have intelligence resources, okay? They're still in command of that. They have all the communication devices, okay? That would be happening. There would be communication because nothing has really changed in terms of command. So the lieutenant colonel, who is in charge of the battalion, he's a combat commander, says, okay, he made the decision, allegedly, right, to use the army to go clear the fort of civilians, all right, and hopefully restore some order because things are getting too chaotic. You have civilians on a military installation. And of course, there's a lot of secret stuff that, the military would have that wouldn't want civilians to have access to or shouldn't have access to. So that decision was made. To send, okay, I would say it probably was a platoon size unit, okay, because obviously they wouldn't send the whole battalion. Battalion could be for anywhere from 500 to over 1,000 troops, right? And I doubt that amount was sent that day. To me, it would have been a platoon size, which is like anywhere from 3 to 5 squads would have probably went up there. And each squad usually could be, depending on the mission. Again, a lot of these things change depending on the mission. Okay, sometimes you add extra sections depending on the mission. So what you would have had, you probably would have had about 3 to 5 squads that day. They might have used a maximum, might have been 5 squad. Each squad, depending on, again, might be 10 to 12 men. Okay, so you're talking about, 5 times 10 to 12 men. You're talking about probably about 60 soldiers, probably that went up to the fort, I would believe. You understand? I was not there. I remember I told you guys I was on Green Street looking at what was going on. Okay? I was not there. I would assume that it's probably about 60, between 50 and 60 soldiers would have probably gone to Fort Rupert. Okay? And I'm not sure why the major would have gone, because generally the major is more at the staff level, at the battalion level. Okay? But the major was there with the lieutenant. Okay? And generally the lieutenant will be in charge of the platoon. So I'm not sure how the command structure was working out. The major, again, the major is more of a staff officer, not so much a tactical combat guy. But however, that particular day, Major was there. Okay? So it's quite obvious the Major is the highest ranking officer present on the mission. Okay? So I'm not sure if he was, directing stuff or whatever. Some people would have alleged that he might have volunteered for the mission because he might have seen it as some attempt to destroy the revolution. So he wanted to be part of protecting the revolution. And you have to also understand that some of this by certain officers were actually done under duress, because there is this particular individual who actually wanted to resist command to go on the fort. And of course, he was pressured. So he eventually got away. So he actually got away when there was a trial for the events of October 19, 1983. And, he was released because he did what he did under duress. It's also reported from the military side that they believe they weren't heading into any big combat situation because, of course, you approach situations, all right, based on the threat level, what you expect to find, what you expect to deal with. So you will approach a situation based on the threat level. Obviously, they said that they didn't believe that the threat level was high, and that is the reason why the Major might have been out of the turret. Okay? That's the reason why that the Major might have been out of the turret. Again, as I said, the Major is generally at the battalion level, and I don't believe it was a battalion size, obviously not, that went to Fort Rupert. But the lieutenant was there, so I think in terms of the actual combat role, the lieutenant would have been in charge of the platoon. One of the major areas of contention is who fired first. Okay? If you listen to what the army guys say, they would say they fired second. The first set of fire came from the crowd. Okay? If you listen to civilians who were actually present, they would tell you that there was no discussion. There was no loudspeaker coming up before to say, clear the fort. There was no warning. And they would tell you that the army fired first. Now, I have looked at a documentary that a gentleman from Trinidad did a while ago, where he actually interviewed some of the guys who were involved in all of this, okay? And he actually interviewed the lieutenant. And what is interesting for people who may understand a little bit about the military, what is interesting, there was a part in the documentary where the lieutenant said that allegedly, if I remember well, he might have fired a rocket for shock effect. So that statement was very telling, okay? Because he said he fired a rocket for shock effect. Now, me analyzing that and understanding certain things kind of makes me wonder, okay? Because anyone who understands a little about this, if you're firing for shock effect, think of it carefully. You're not firing second. You're firing first. Because nobody fires for shock effect second. Okay? Now, if you're firing second, let's say you receive fire, and you're firing second, you're not firing for shock effect. You're opening up. Okay? You're opening up. There's no shock effect there. Okay? There is, all guns blazing. Okay? So if you say you fired a rocket for shock effect, my interpretation is that you fired first to kind of shock the crowd. You understand? That's my interpretation of that. I don't know if the lieutenant had a different intent in when he said that. But to me, having a little bit of understanding of this stuff would say that if you fire for shock effect, you're firing first. You're not firing second. Because nobody fires second for shock effect. As I have said, if you receive fire and you fire it second, you're firing because you want to neutralize your target. You see what I'm saying? So that may correlate with what much of the people who were present on that day said. Okay? I recently saw there was some, I think it was on Facebook, some dude had wrote about some of the events of October 19, and a particular very well-known woman who was in media for decades, said that she was there talking to another friend, had just moved, and as soon as the army came up, they fired. Again, there's another gentleman that I had a personal conversation with, and he said the exact same thing. Okay? So, ensuing in all of that, it is alleged that someone in the crowd, okay, probably after seeing this, they're thinking, oh my God, these people come here to fight. So that individual allegedly would have used a pistol and would have shot the major. Okay? Fatally. That shot would prove extremely fatal. Okay? And you know, militarily, one will understand what will take place in such a situation. Okay? Then all bets are off the table. It's okay, let's neutralize, you know, this whole threat and let's deal with this situation. Okay? As a matter of fact, I've seen a little bit of documentary from people who was actually there. And there was a major at the time who actually was on the fort. Okay? He didn't come with the units that actually stormed the fort. He was actually on the fort, probably stationed during, you know, before the whole thing transpired. Okay? And he said that eventually the guys who stormed the fort were able to flank and get at the top square. You see what I'm saying? And he said that they were fine dung. Everybody understands if you find dung, forget about it. And you're talking about, you're talking about serious weaponry, okay? You know, so you could imagine what this is all about. Now, I'm saying we're so far away. We're looking at this from Green Street, and we're hearing what's going on over there. We're hearing the fire. So I could only imagine that the people who are actually there close to the events, you can imagine what's going on with them. You see what I'm saying? And of course, I told you guys about the story where they jumped off the fort and we could have stayed on Green Street and see all of that stuff. You see what I'm saying? So that's crazy. So eventually, obviously, they neutralized any little bit of threat that came from the crowd. And obviously, we know that they rounded up who they were looking for. Some people were lucky. Some people escaped. Okay, some people were allowed to escape. Okay, some of the soldiers was, you know, kind to, you just let a couple of people pass by because, they, you know, they weren't looking for them. You know, this was more a confrontation between Maurice and his close supporters and these guys. So a lot of people walked and they just, you know, allowed them to walk by. You see what I'm saying? So we have to say that in some respects, some of the soldiers showed some sort of compassion to people who were there. You see what I'm saying? So obviously, okay, these people were rounded up eventually. And we know what happened subsequently. But prior to that, it is alleged, okay, that because of the back and forth communication, that's something that's alleged, okay, that somebody might have recorded, right? And it's alleged that some of that communication between Fort Rupert and Region 1, Fort Frederick, would have been intercepted by the police station, because, you know, it's radio waves, right? So sometimes when you get on the radio, depending on the channel, channels may cross, but it's alleged that the police station might have heard a bit of the communication. And it's alleged that they might have heard what was said, okay, between the guys at Region 1 and the guys at Fort Rupert that day. That is alleged. Okay, they might have heard the communication and they might have heard some sort of, not a structured order being given, but something being said, okay, that will translate into an order to basically commit the acts that were eventually committed and the assassinations. Okay, so that is what is alleged. Okay, so let's analyze all of this a little bit. And let me give you my overall or overarching understanding of the situation. So let's start from the final event, that Maurice and his associates were subjected to a firing squad. Okay? That is clear. There's no disputing that. Maurice and his associates are gone. Maurice and his associates were unalived. That is a fact. No one is going to dispute that happened. Okay? Now, it's quite obvious the civilians who were present on the fort did not do that. Okay? And I think it's reasonable to assume that the guys who stormed the fort are the ones that did that. And there have been multiple trials, and the court has said they were complicit in that. Okay? So I don't think there's no dispute that that was done. That final act was committed by the guys who stormed the fort. Okay? And there's specifics about the individuals that actually were part of the firing squad. Okay? So we know all of this stuff. This is recorded stuff, indisputable fact. So the question is, how did it end up being that way? And my belief or my understanding is that the events that happened there and then on October 19 was actually a culmination of a brewing division that existed a very long time ago within the ranks of the PRG. Okay? This didn't happen. They didn't just get up one day, as some people have you believe, that all of these events unfolded. But people who are intimately, or who were intimately familiar with what was going on within the PRG will tell you different. They would tell you that they always sensed there was some sense of division, okay, and rivalry taking place, okay? And then it was pretty much an alliance of convenience and continued to be an alliance of convenience. So that when there was the simplest possible sign of stress or pressure on the revolution, those divisions became more and more apparent. And there was a fracturing in the leadership of the PRG. And of course, it's quite obvious which side the army took. So there are certain events that people would say that the army was preparing for this, or the upper echelon leadership was preparing for this, or saw what was taking place, so they preempted a lot of things. Some may also say the army guys will tell you that they did this to preserve the revolution. That would be their perspective. Not just to preserve themselves, but to preserve the state and the revolution. Okay? So you had events happen way before October 19, such as demilitarization of certain militias that was deemed as favorable to Maurice Bishop. St. Paul's militia, River Road militia, and a couple other militias, okay, was demilitarized under the guise of having to change the weapons. So that may seem suspicious. Why was that done? Why were the militias demilitarized? Then the whole question of joint leadership. This is something that I don't think we've ever seen in the history of Grenada, joint leadership. So that would have been a very difficult thing, an unpalatable thing for the Grenadian people and Grenadian masses to accept. Grenadians generally, as they say, believe in more of a kind of cult-like figure per se. So some may say that the whole introduction of this whole joint leadership was an attempt to promote, okay, their guy, the Aura guy's guy. That is what some people would say and interpret the whole idea of pushing a joint leadership was to promote their guy. So then the counter argument is going to be had where they would say that, oh, well, we had a central committee and we had democratic centralism in the central committee, one man, one vote. So if you make a decision, you can renege on the decision. That would be their argument. But the question again would be, are there mechanisms in place when you renege on a decision made by the CC? What was the recourse if you can't find some sort of common ground? Who ultimately makes a decision? Was the CC treated as part of official government, or was it a separate to government, as the current parties are sometimes separate from the actual administration of government? Okay, the government may consist of people from the party, okay, but the party itself is a distinct organization. Is that the case, or was that the case with the CC? The question is, did Grenadian people understand that upper echelon decisions were made for Grenada by a CC? Did anyone understand that? I doubt, very unlikely anyone understood that, okay? And most people would have believed that Maurice Bishop was the ultimate decision maker when it comes to the affairs of Grenada. I also believe that when you analyze everything, that there were a few miscalculations by all the parties involved. Okay? And if you look at it, it was not a mystery that the party that triumphed, because they had all the factors in their favor. Now, if we were to refer to, again, back to these great political theorists and military theorists like Niccolo Machiavelli, now there are a couple of things that Niccolo Machiavelli said that leaders, especially leaders who are leading under power politics, should do. Okay? And he says, he advises that the leader, okay, should always ally himself with the stronger part of the population. Okay? Obviously, the stronger part of the population then would have been the military. And we see it was the military because they triumphed over the masses. Now, if there was a responsible militia, okay, who in some way could have offered some sort of challenge or check and balance to the military, then that would have been a whole different story. And I told you guys about the whole concept of a security battalion that was introduced but did not come to fruition. Okay? And that security battalion was supposed to be a sort of check and balance to the army. Okay? They were responsible. They would have been responsible for protection of ministries and protection of the leadership. Now, again, I had mentioned this before, that once you have a guard company responsible for guarding the leadership, and that guard company is under the leadership of the army, that's a no-no. Okay? Forget about it. There's really no protection around the leadership. Because as I have mentioned before, every part of the world, guards are always distinct and separate from the army for good reasons. For good reasons. So another critical and important thing that Niccolo Machiavelli says that leaders should do, okay? He said that leaders should constantly give their troops adventures, okay, to go on so that they get a sense of gratification. Because you can't have troops training, okay, flying rungs every day, okay, and training for combat, and they have no opportunity to exercise a little bit of what they've learned. They're going to get frustrated. They're going to get antsy. That is why when the opportunity presented itself on October 19th, 1983, remember, these soldiers are trained. They were actually in some ways would have been elated to go on a little adventure. Okay? Now, I'm not saying they would have been elated to go and shoot down civilians, but just the thought of an opportunity to exercise all the military things that they've been practicing, they would have felt some sense of adrenaline and would have been excited to do that. So it would not have taken much convincing them to do that. I also believe that one of the problems with the PRG, and I think many people have reasoned that also, that there was no effective means of dealing with crowd control. Okay? It was always the use of the military to sort of deal with some sort of crowd control, right? Even with all the rallies and stuff like that. So when that crisis happened on October 19, there actually was no real means to deal with crowd control, okay? None at all. There was some talk about use of tear gas in the Market Square area, but apparently it was said that when they came back with the tear gas, the crowd had already moved all the way up to Mount Weldale. So that was ineffective. So some may also say that there was a heightened level of paranoia, okay? And that whole concept of preserving the revolution was always talked about. And any slightest thing that seemed like something that would have impeded the revolution was seen as a threat that needed to be dealt with or gotten rid of. So there was that sense, that was a prevailing order. So when this leadership crisis occurred, some would have seen this as some sort of attack on the revolution, and they needed to push back to preserve the revolution, as if the revolution was some holy concept, okay? Some holy concept distinct and separate from the people who made up the revolution. So when things came to a head, it was quite obvious, okay, that those two factions that came together to form the NJM really and truly were not together. Because as soon as the opportunity presented itself and there was a crisis and there was pressure on the PRG, those two factions immediately fractured into their individual sects. And some may say strategically, all the officer candidates were planted at the upper echelon of the army. So somebody might have taken Niccolo Machiavelli's advice, and it wasn't Maurice. So if you listen to the army guys and the guys who prevailed on that day, they would tell you, oh, none of this was planned. This just unfolded. But then you have to ask yourself the question, why so many things were done that seemed to be a checkmate to Maurice and his people? Why was the chief of staff pretty much incapacitated? Okay? Is it because he supported Maurice? Why was the general of the army pretty much did not act like a general? What was his role during October 19th? He seemed to have been sidelined in all of this. So let's get to the issue of command. And people would say, and some would say, oh, well, this unfolded. We didn't take any command. Nobody commanded us to do anything. Well, you and I know that's hogwash, because it is critical. It is essential to an army, okay? The 3 C's, CQ, to have command, control, and communication. Without these 3 things, forget about it. You don't have an army. And command is so emphasized and so critical, is organic, okay, to an army. So you cannot act without command. So somebody or some bodies must have commanded those actions on October 19, 1983. Again, in an army, you cannot act without command. It's impossible. There are severe consequences for acting without command, or severe consequences for not following command. We all know that. So even if they may want to say that, oh, well, things unfolded, just by the nature of your rank, or just by the nature of your position, you have to accept responsibility. Even if it wasn't your intent to do or things to unfold the way it unfolded, just by your very command, just by your very rank, that is a responsibility that has to be accepted with that rank. I mean, this is just obvious throughout even the work environment, simple work environment. If you're the CEO of a company and things go wrong, okay, ultimately, you would get blamed and you are responsible. You can't shuck your responsibility and say, oh, well, it's not me. It's the person lower down. Or, oh, it's just the environment. Or, oh, things just unraveled. So that doesn't make any sense. So let's talk about Maurice and his associates. He may have been commander-in-chief, but there came a point where a line was drawn and he was commander-in-chief only in name. Okay? Only in name at that time. Because the real command and control and communication was in the hands of the people who triumphed against him that particular day. Their command wasn't broken. Okay? The military command was not broken. Again, we could go back to advice from Niccolo Machiavelli. And he says, you can have good laws, but if you don't have an army to enforce those laws, or you don't have a force or a body to enforce those laws are null and void. Okay? So for you to have command and for you to have power and for you to have laws and enforce laws, you have to have the ability to enforce those laws and the ability to protect your power. So there was a fatal miscalculation, okay, on that particular day. In people's head, they might have thought they were in charge, okay? And they had the masses on their side. But the masses weren't the stronger part of the population. And now we can go back and take a little advice from a great military theorist, Sun Tzu. And what does he say? He says that he who knows when to fight and when not to fight, shall not lose in 1,000 battles. So it was quite obvious. And knowing when and how to fight is only done by estimation, by calculation, okay? By ensuring that you have certain principles and factors in your favor. If you do not have those principles and factors in your favor, then you should not fight. You should run. You should escape. And Sun Tzu actually says that he who is not able to fight should bury himself or hide himself in the deepest recesses of the earth. And there's amazing stories of individuals who hide, okay, and got away and survived. For example, the same gentleman who was alleged to have shot the major, he evaded the army, okay? He evaded them. And there's another amazing story of a certain gentleman who was a bodyguard for Maurice Bishop, who was actually with Maurice on that particular day, October 19. He also escaped and he evaded the army. They couldn't find him. They were looking all over for him. Okay? And it's alleged that he's actually from the western side, but it's alleged that he hid out in the middle of the country. Okay? In the Birch Grove area. These people, some of them, understood the gravity of the situation and understood that there was no way they could have challenged the power of the army. They had all the military hardware, okay? They had all the training. They're more organized. They're more structured. The masses are chaotic, okay? The masses can't challenge the army, okay? And on top of that, what does the army have on its side? It has counterintelligence. It has people throughout the crowd who is possibly feeding information back and forth. Okay? So being involved in a revolution, all this stuff, and I know some would say, oh, well, no one expects your own to betray you. But history is littered and filled with examples of betrayal. Okay? Betrayal is not new. I mean, we have age-old stories. We have Jesus and Judas. Okay? We have Jesus and Thomas. And I'm not comparing anyone to Jesus here, the Lord and Savior. Okay? Not at all. But these stories are there to give us something to look at and to understand a bit of human nature and humanity and the fallibility of the human beast. So in all of this, there is great lessons to be learned. Let's hope that we all can learn what needed to be learned from those events of October 19, 1983. So if you want some really good information, I think you need to get a hold of this book called Big Sky, Little Bullet. It's by Maurice Patterson, a gentleman I knew personally, who is just a wonderful gentleman, a very smart guy, did thorough research. So funny, you know, we used to walk, sometimes, you know, I used to walk at him from the carnage and we'll just chat and have discussion. I felt like I was one of the few people that he would actually speak to, you know what I'm saying? Because I never really see him speaking to too many people, you know what I'm saying? He just kind of kept to himself and did his thing, you know, and he, you know, would walk around and he had that kind of skank, you know, I call it a skank. I kind of like, you know, I kind of walk, you know what I'm saying? And sometimes him and I would walk with him from Carnage all the way through Lagoon Road. And he used to live in the Pandy Beach area. And I would just walk with him and we'll chat about a lot of things, about history, about some of his experiences in the 70s, because he was a kind of black power guy, you know what I'm saying? And we'll have some really interesting conversations. And then I'll walk all the way with him till Pandy Beach. And for those of you who don't know, you know, I'm a Belmont guide too, you know what I'm saying? So I would walk over there and I'll, you know, get at the top of Pandy Beach. I will chat for a little some more, sit down by the wall, and then he will head on down and I will walk back, okay? Walk back over to Green Street, you know what I'm saying? And as I said, I felt appreciated in a sense because I never saw him talking to too many people, but he'd always talk to me, you know what I'm saying? We'll always have some interesting conversations, you know what I'm saying? But get a hold of his book, He has done some thorough research, okay, of things that actually happened during the PRG and things that happened after the PRG. And a lot of what he said and a lot of the things I personally experienced, I feel like they coincide a bit. You see what I'm saying? So I think he really did his research. There's actual, I think, parts of it where he interviewed actual soldiers, Grenadian soldiers who fought. You see what I'm saying? I think it's a very good book. Every young Grenadian should probably try to get their hands on it. Okay? And it'll tell you a lot. It'll explain a lot of what happened during the PRG and post-PRG. So I hope some of the money for that book gets to his family because it was a really great book. You know, he was a good guy. I would, you know, see him as a bit of the sort of Derek Walcott guy of Grenada. You see what I'm saying? He was an intellectual in his own right, you know, and someone that we should have appreciated, put it that way. It's so interesting that when I worked at Barclays Bank, I used to work in the computer department. Back then, I did all the data processing and data capture in the background. You know what I'm saying? So we, you know, did all of that stuff. And my supervisor, a lady, she told me how much she had assisted Maurice Patterson when he was doing his book and, you know, type up a lot of stuff for him and help him out and stuff like that. So that was interesting to know, you know, and I worked with her. I mean, she was my supervisor in the data processing and data capture department of Barclays Bank back then. So that was the events of October 19th. Now, after that happened, okay, crowds dispersed. Everybody's, you know, just trying to, you know, everybody's terrified. I could never forget where I was sitting at the dining table when, at the time, General Hudson Austin came on the radio and just called out the names of the people who got shot and stuff like that. Never forget that. I was sitting there, you know, at the dinner table, you know, and I remember that. So I think I told some stories about, you know, that period from October 19th to 25th. And I kind of told you guys that people were on lockdown and people were kind of terrified and, you know, uncertain, not sure what's happening. And, you know, of course, they had talked about the RMC. They were in charge now, you know, as some sort of temporary government or whatever. And I spoke about in that period where they might have let people out for a day or two to go get some groceries and, you know, and stuff like that. So a little background now about the U.S. involvement, okay? So there were a lot of crazy things happening in the Middle East, okay? Actually in Lebanon at the time, because the fleet that came to Grenada was actually diverted from Lebanon, okay? And there was a horrible, you know, a situation with a Marine camp, you know, in Lebanon. So that diversion, the fleet diverted to Grenada. A lot of them probably never even heard of Grenada before that. You see what I'm saying? And it was an opportunity, I believe, in their minds at the time to score a quick victory against Marxism, because you have to understand the climate of the 80s. They were competing forces for capitalism and Marxism, you know, all over the world. And if you said you're a Marxist, you put up your hand and say, I'm a Marxist, then of course that side will just, you know, load you up with weapons and, you know, because they were competing, you know, for souls across the world. You see what I'm saying? I mean, there's even one story that was related that the PRG themselves, when they received so much assistance, you know, from the then Soviet Union via Cuba, they were just flabbergasted with the amount of weapons that they got. You know, they was like, oh my God, you know? So yeah, so that was the climate that existed in the 80s at that time. You know what I'm saying? So that was the world we're living in. You know, there's a lot of stuff happening all over the world. If you think things are happening now, there's no comparison. Absolutely no comparison. So then you can look at some other stories on my channel and I talk about what we saw on October 25th. Of course, we awoke early in the morning and, you know, invasion. Okay? So yeah, that's what it is. So I want you to understand. So let me clarify. And I want to do this for the youth of Grenada so they understand. So there was a PRG government. There was a fracture in the government. One side. And those two sides came to a head. One side prevailed. Okay? That side prevailed. And the side that prevailed, it ended up with a situation where Maurice Bishop and his close associates were liquidated. Okay? They were liquidated. And the side that prevailed, obviously, that ended up with Maurice Bishop and a lot of his close associates losing their lives. Okay? That's how that ended. Okay? And then that side that prevailed became rulers of the government, de facto rulers of the government at the time. Okay? Because of course, Maurice Bishop was the prime minister. He and all his guys and a couple of his cabinet ministers got liquidated. So the side that prevailed now then became in charge. They formed what they call a ruling military council. Okay? As it implies, it's a military council. And they now are in charge of Grenada from October 19th, after Maurice and his cabinet ministers and others, okay, were neutralized. Okay, so they're in charge from October 19th to 25th. Okay, when the Americans invaded, came in and then neutralized them. Okay, and brought some semblance of peace and stability and a bit of restoration of democracy to Grenada. So that is the story. I hope it wasn't too laborious, but there's certain things I had to explain so that you will understand what really happened. So hopefully I added some clarity to this and you understand what led up to the events of October 19, 1983, and subsequently what led to the invasion by the United States of America on October 25th, 1983. Okay? With that, guten Tag.